Paul puts this very bluntly in Romans when he says that, what shall we say then? If the glory of God abounds by my lie, would it be all right for God to judge me? Or rather, and he quotes some people saying, shall we not do evil that good may come? One little personal story. Many of you are acquainted with a well-known radio evangelist by the name of C.M. Ward. His father was A.G. Ward, one time pastor of a church in Toronto, Canada. And he had an evangelist who was reporting more hands in the balcony than there were people coming down to the altar. And finally, A.G. Ward, who had been praying, he began to, a little different way, he began to watch and pray. And he parted his fingers and watched what was going on, and he said to the evangelist afterward, he said, it appears to me, brother, that you were reporting more hands being raised for prayer than actually were coming down to the altar. And rather glibly, the man replied, yes, he said, that encourages others to hold up their hands. He said that to the wrong man. A.G. Ward lowered his voice, and he said, my brother, from now on I will watch all the time while I pray. If you report one hand that is not actually raised, you will never preach in this church again. That's my kind of man. That's what Jesus is talking about in methodology. Nothing false, nothing sham, nothing pretense. Total reality. We do not promote the work of God just by meeting human external needs that perish with the body. We do not use spectacular methods to draw men. We do not use shoddy methods, Satan's methods to draw men. We depend upon the word of God. Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. May it be so. And after he had successfully defeated the temptations of Satan by 3 quotations from the book of Deuteronomy, the farewell speeches of Moses, delivered at the foot of Mount Pisgah, Nebo, east of Jordan. After he had successfully defeated Satan, then the angels came again. The temptations began with the coming of the Spirit who drove him into the wilderness with the ringing voice of God in his ears, thou art my son, and closes with the angels ministering unto him and Satan having fled. But it says for a season. Even when you won the victory for the time being, you've not seen the last of the devil. He does not give up because of 1 or 2 or 3 defeats. We switch ourselves entirely now to another subject, which is in John, chapter 1, verse 19. The first 18 verses of John have been a prologue, and the rest of our material for some time have been from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now we come back to the testimony of John when the Jews wanted to find out how he conceived of himself. Well, you read for us through verse 23.
And this is the testimony of John. And the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, who are you? He confessed, he did not deny, but confessed, I am not the Christ. They asked him, what then? Are you Elijah? He said, I am not. Are you the prophet? And he answered, no. They said to him then, who are you? Let us have an answer for those who sent us. What do you say about yourself? He said, I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as the prophet Isaiah said.
All right, now we have this question asked of John, who are you? First of all, I'm not the Messiah. I am not Elijah. Now, this is based upon the fact that in the very closing verses of the last book of the Old Testament, the promise is given that Elijah shall come before that great and terrible day of the Lord. And there still are people from time to time who are still writing pamphlets on the idea that Elijah must come back before the end of the age. They simply have not read what Jesus said elsewhere, even though John denied this himself. Jesus said that he had come in the spirit and power of Elijah. And then it goes on to say elsewhere, later we'll come to that, that this he spake concerning John the Baptist. It goes on to give the fact that John had been beheaded in prison. There's no question about which John is meant. But John at the moment disclaimed that he was Elijah. He may have come in the power and the spirit of Elijah, but he was not Elijah. And this, of course, would contradict any idea of reincarnation. So do not expect John the Baptist to be Elijah in the literal sense. On the other hand, do not expect Elijah to come back before the end of this age. He's already been here. We come now to the matter of the question, are you the prophet? That would mean, is he Moses? Moses promised a prophet like unto himself to come, and he should be heard by the people. He denied he was that prophet. So they said, how do you account for yourself? And as we've said earlier, he's the herald, the one who proclaims ahead of time the king is coming. Get out and get the road fixed. Prepare the way for his coming. And these men had come from the sect of the Jews called the Pharisees. It might not be beside the point to pause here a moment and define a few terms we'll be using here. There are a number of groups of people, parties within the New Testament Judaic family. We have the terms Pharisees, Sadducees, Herodians, Essenes, and so on. Let's look at these for just a moment. The Pharisees were the descendants of a group called the Hasidim, or the Holy Ones. They were the ones who believed that if you kept the law, and every Jew kept the law perfectly for one day, that the Messiah would come. In this process, they had built up a lot of secondary and third-level interpretations. And without being lighthearted about anybody's religious scruples, we can fairly say some of these were carried to quite some lengths. One would be, for example, the question of, since it's wrong to use a servant on the Sabbath day, or wrong to work yourself on the Sabbath day, what about your hen? If your hen lays an egg on the Sabbath day, can you use the egg? She's obviously a sinner, of course. She has broken the Sabbath. She has worked on the Sabbath day. Now, can you eat an egg which was laid in sin? And the strict party said, no, the egg cannot be used. And the lenient party said, yes, you can use the egg because the hen did not really know that she was breaking the law. The question is raised, since you cannot cook on the Sabbath day, can you cook your stew and get it hot on top of the stove, usually a kind of a brick oven type stove which will hold heat for a long time, and then just before the sun goes down on Friday, can you stuff the firebox full of wood and keep the stove hot all night and have hot soup to eat on the Sabbath day, even though you did not cook it on the Sabbath day? The answer is no, because cooking is done on a stove and it's work to cook. Can you build a shelf on the wall? It comes out over the stove, 1 inch off of the stove, and can you store the pot on the shelf? Yes? That's perfectly all right. You can cook the meal on the stove, take the hot pot, and put it on the shelf, which does not touch the stove, and this is not work. You can store food on the shelf if you want to. Now, this is the type of thing later that Jesus just had no time for at all. He was in favor, actually, of many of the things the Pharisees taught. He was far closer to the Pharisees than he was to the Sadducees, far closer than he was to the Herodians, certainly far closer than he was to the Zealots. And he was not an Essene. But right inside of this complete belief in the Scriptures, this taking them out to impossible limits, was not the spirit of Jesus at all. He found fault with them because he said, you're so careful to keep the law of tithing